can you grab that building campaign report? Can you send the worship application?
Can you get an attendance report for the elder board?
Debbie's saying.
Time to clean out the baptism.
I need you to order donuts.
Can you grab a report first, Gary?
I got it.
Well, hey, everybody, welcome. I'm Sean, Managing Director here at the Unstuck Group, and I'm really glad that you carved out time to be here today. Let me start with a number, because it's the number that got us thinking about this whole conversation and where we're going with today's webinar. By most estimates, only about 2% of churches in America ever reach 1,000 people in weekend attendance. Added to that, research out of the Hartford Institute tells this similar story, just from a different angle. Roughly 70% of everyone who attends church in this country, the United States, is gathered into the largest 10% of congregations. So we've got a whole lot of small and mid-sized churches out there, but we've got a small number of larger ones where most people actually are. Now, if you're leading a church somewhere in that 500 to 900 range, you're close enough to feel the growth pains, but not quite over the line. And this can be a really tough season because you've prayed about it. You're working really hard. You've got a clear mission. I'm sure you love your people, but certain parts of your ministry are starting to feel broken or starting to feel stuck. And the temptation for you can be just keep plugging away and hoping that at some point you're going to break through the threshold. But hope isn't a strategy. So here's what I want you to hear right at the very top. In our experience, and we've served nearly 800 churches now, the reason that most churches don't break through the 1,000 barrier isn't for a lack of hard work. It's actually structural. And that should be really encouraging news, because there are some predictive shifts that you need to make in order to continue health and growth in a way that doesn't kill your team. So that's what today is all about. We're going to walk through the 5 most common barriers we see keeping churches from growing past 1,000. And we're going to do it in 3 different conversations. First, we're going to name the tension so you can honestly figure out which of these you're actually bumping up against. Then we'll talk about the solution and the shift each one requires. And we'll land with some practical next steps so that you don't just walk away with a diagnosis of where you might be feeling stuck. You'll walk away knowing where to start. And our goal for the entire conversation today is to help you feel equipped to make the necessary commitment for your own leadership and clearly understand your specific next steps. So before we get into the content, let me introduce my co-host for today's webinar. Doug Dameron is the lead and founding pastor of Orchard Church in Denver, Colorado, and an Unstuck consultant on our team. Doug and his wife, Shelly, planted Orchard back in 2005. And over the next 10 years, God grew their church from a small group of people to over 1,700 in attendance. Now they sit at over 3,000 in attendance. So Doug knows a thing or two about the shifts that churches have to make to break through that 1,000 barrier and go beyond. Doug, thanks a lot for joining me and helping me with the conversation today.
Hey, great to be with you, Sean. Honored to have this conversation. This is certainly a subject that I am very, very passionate about. I'm going to believe that everyone that's tuning into this is tuning in because they want their church to grow, and that is a good thing.
That's right.
You know, Jesus in Luke chapter 14, verse 23, he talked about advancing and building his kingdom, and he said, go out into the country lanes and behind the hedges and urge anyone you find to come so that the house will be full. And so I believe Jesus wants our churches to grow more than anyone else. He loves our community and people more than we do, and he wants them to grow.
I like that, Doug. And that's why I thought you'd be a great fit for helping with today's conversation. So thanks for doing this. And a little bit later, we're going to hear from Pastor Andy Craver. He's the lead pastor at Upward Christian Fellowship in Flat Rock, North Carolina. And he's going to share some of his story of leading his church through this attendance barrier. Our team actually started working with Andy's church back before they had 1,000 in attendance. So I'm really excited for you to hear his story as well. So a few logistical things before we go through today's conversation. Of course, we have chat and live Q&A in Zoom. You can use chat to share the conversation with others who are in the webinar today. Q&A is where you can post your questions for the live Q&A that Doug and I will be doing at the end of today's webinar. If you'd like to have the companion workbook, and I'd encourage you to download it, you can go to the unstuckgroup.com/workbook to get it there. There will be lots of ways to interact with today's conversation using that workbook. Tiffany, Sarah, and some of our team will be interacting via chat and helping us to identify those questions. So you can connect with our team there. They'll be active in the chat window. And then if you'd like to share today's conversation on social media, you can do that on X and Facebook. Just use the hashtag UnstuckChurch. All right. So let's get started here. I want to start with assessing the tension that you feel when your church is in the season, because every good plan, we say this all the time, it's built on an honest assessment. And here's the principle I want to keep going back to as we talk through this together. Your church is perfectly built for the size that it is today. Nobody intentionally decides to cap their church at 800 people. Most just kept doing what worked when they were 300 people, and that works until it doesn't work any longer. So when you start to run into barriers, you typically run into them in three places: your leaders, your space, and your systems. And there are 5 specific lids or tension points within those that I want to talk about today. As Doug and I talk through them, I don't want you to try to solve anything yet. I just want you to notice which of these makes you feel a little uncomfortable. That's the lid or the lids that are probably capping your church and your growth right now. So let's start with the first, and that's your leaders. And it starts with the person who's leading the whole thing, the senior pastor. Doug, would you share just a bit about how the senior pastor themselves can become a lid to the growth at this stage specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I lived this. I had been a part of some other churches before we launched our church, Orchard Church, 21 years ago. But I had never led a church past about 350 people. And so I had to grow myself as a leader. Our church now is running around 3,000, but I've never led a church this size. I've never led a staff this size. I didn't want to be the lid to our church growing. So I had to grow with our church. So there are a lot of books, podcasts, mentors and coaches in my life, and the Unstuck group, as a matter of fact, that I leaned on to help me go where I had never been. I've got a few books that I just want to throw out there that were really helpful to me. There's a great book called Breaking Growth Barriers by Warren Bird and Carl George. It's been around a long time.
Yeah.
They've done some revisions. That was super helpful. Hero Maker by Dave Ferguson and Warren Bird. Teams That Thrive by Ryan Hartwig. And then, of course, I have to mention The Unstuck Church by Tony Morgan. That's
my favorite.
That's the best one. And those books were all super helpful and monumental in helping me to scale our church, to make sure that we were always able to continue to grow. One of the things that happened in my life is this was a monumental mind shift. I had to go from being the primary minister to being the primary minister maker. And that really ties into what Paul said in Ephesians chapter 4:11, that I'm to equip the saints to do the work of ministry. I couldn't do everything. I couldn't meet every need. One of the monumental shifts that we made when we were about 500 people, I hired a care pastor because I couldn't keep up with all the care. I was having to put people off 3 and 4 weeks, and that was too long. And so I've had a care pastor ever since. I rarely do weddings. I rarely do funerals. I tell our people, you don't want to see me at the hospital. If I show up at the hospital, it's not good unless you're just probably, it's bad. Unless you're probably one of my really close friends. And I've showed up to some of my friends and they're like, am I that bad? And I'm like, no, I'm here for you as your friend. But I just realized I couldn't do it all. And I have a responsibility to make sure our people are cared for, but it doesn't mean I have to be the one doing that care. And I think that's a monumental shift, because a lot of pastors go into ministry because they love people and they care for people. But if you're going to scale your ministry, you got to have people help with the care. Yeah. And I also had to go from a shepherd mindset to a rancher mindset, that I'm leading other shepherds and delegate. And so I could focus on the things we talk about at the Unstuck group as a lead pastor, focusing on things I cannot delegate, like vision and communication and culture and leadership development. And so that was a monumental shift. And I just had to continue to grow as a leader as our church has grown.
That's good, Doug. Those are some significant shifts. And part of that too, and I hear in your story, is finding a bit of your wiring and what you're wired to be great at, which I think is really important.
Absolutely.
And here's what I'd add to that, because the senior pastor being the lid is rarely the only team lid. It's usually right on top of the second lid, which is the structure underneath the senior pastor, and then the volunteer bench that's underneath that. So let me describe what that looks like. And you tell me, or you can't tell me on the other side of the webinar, but see if this feels familiar to you. Most churches grow and stick with one org chart as they grow. And that's usually with everybody reporting to the senior pastor. And that's fine when you're 200 people, but at 800, that type of org chart means your senior pastor is sitting in every meeting and approving every decision, and pretty quickly they become the bottleneck for the whole organization. The structure that helped you feel more like a team when you were small starts to feel like a big traffic jam when you're large. And then there's the rest of the org chart. Here's the pattern that I often see with churches of this size. Doug, you talked about this as a shift. They've hired doers, specialists, and shepherds, but they haven't hired people to be leaders of leaders or to develop other people. And again, doing that as a church of 200 or 500 seems to make more sense, but you often end up in this strange spot where on paper, you look overstaffed. And at the same time, the team feels completely understaffed. We actually came up with a term for this. We call it the understaffed team with too many people. Underneath the staff, the story with the volunteers can be very similar to this. There is a volunteer bench problem when you have a small number of highly committed people who've been leading more and more of the ministry as you've grown. And as your church grows, their energy starts to drain. When you start talking about a new initiative, like adding a third service or a new ministry, the conversation in churches like this, it usually dies pretty quickly because there's no bench to pull new leaders from to start these new things. I was working with a church recently on this, and they're a great church and they have momentum right now. But there's a lot that's great that's happening, but they only had about 35% of their people serving in the church. And a healthier rate, of course, is closer to 50%. To add to that, their volunteer leader ratio is around 20 people in attendance for every one volunteer leader. A healthy ratio looks like more closer to 10 to 1. And they have great dreams around how to sustain their momentum, steward the people that God's sending their direction. But right now, they don't have the bench to pull it off. And I think that's the tension. If your structure was built to keep everything close to the top, close to the senior pastor, and your bench, your volunteer bench was built to maintain what you already have, you're not ready to go start what's next. You're not ready to break the next barrier. And a church can only grow as fast as they can raise up leaders to carry that growth. And I actually want to work on that in a few minutes. So we'll come back to that. All right, let's move from leaders to the second place where tension shows up for churches breaking the 1,000 barrier, and that's your space. And there are 3 physical lids that we talk about often: your auditorium or your worship space, your parking, and your kids' space. And I think this is the tension that's most concrete of all the 5. And honestly, it might be the most challenging, because these capacity lids will hurt you no matter how good your service is. You can have the best preaching, the best worship, a great kids environment, but if a family pulls into your lot and can't find a spot to park, or walks in and there's nowhere to sit, or worst of all, and I know some pastors who agonize over this right now, they can't get their kids checked in because you're at capacity in your kids ministry space. Well, then you've capped your growth before the service even starts. What's most frustrating, I think, is that these lids show up before you're full. People start to feel a room is full somewhere between 70 and 80%. It used to be the old 80% rule. I think it's a little, maybe smaller than that now. They don't feel that capacity at 100%. And I think that's same for the kids' rooms. So you can stand in the back on Sunday, you can look around and see open seats and feel like things are just fine, while your church has actually already stopped growing. You're turning people away, but you're just not seeing that happen. And I think all 3 of these lids are connected, which makes it even trickier. You can have plenty of seats and nowhere near enough parking. And now your parking lot is actually deciding how big your church gets, not your worship space. So Doug, you've been through this. You've walked into some of these buildings as well. I'd love for you to weigh in on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I love, Sean, how you pointed out there's three different pinch points, and it's sometimes it's the kids area, sometimes it's the parking, sometimes it's the auditorium. I'll tell you what our story was. We launched our church, in our apartment living room. Then we met in a rec center, and then we moved into a brand new high school auditorium, a new high school that had opened up, and we moved in there with about 100 people, and it was a 600 seat state of the art auditorium. And I remember day one thinking, man, we're like BBs in a pop can. How are we ever gonna, and we roped off everything we could, made everybody sit right down front. And I remember that first day looking around going, how are we ever going to fill this auditorium? We had plenty of kids space. There was unlimited rooms, plenty of parking. And really, even the auditorium, we thought we're never going to fill this. And I felt like God said, you're not, but I am. And within 3 years, we outgrew the auditorium. And I would completely agree with you. It's more the 70% rule than the 80% rule, especially if you're reaching, young families and sometimes first time guests. They want to bring their kids in. They're not sure, can I trust you with my kids yet? So it's not that there aren't seats available. It's 1 or 2 or 3 here, but they're looking for 4 seats, 5 seats, 6 seats. And so we've just found over the last 21 years, our rule is when we hit 70% capacity in our auditorium, it's time to launch another service. So we went from 1 service to 2 services. 3 years later, went to 3 services. We met portable setup and tear down in the same high school for 11 and a half years before we built our first permanent facility. And we just made sure that every time we hit that 70%, we were adding another service. Now you have to make other adjustments because, when we were 1 service, I could preach as long as I wanted. It was probably much longer than it should have been. And every time we'd add a service, the message would get shorter, because we had to turn the services over. And I even actually completely changed my preaching style because I didn't want to hold the church back and, used to do more expositional books of the Bible, but it's hard to cover that in 30, 35 minutes. So we went to more of a topical series approach. We call it topositional. So, but you got to always be adjusting and making those tweaks. And so that, that's not the lid because it can definitely be the facilities.
Yeah, that's good, Doug. Okay, that's leaders and space. The third place the tension shows up is in your systems, kind of the pathways that move a brand new person from the parking lot to actually being a part of the life of the church. And the first system that breaks it, as you grow is I'll just use the word assimilation path. I think that's the broadest, most well-known term to use here. But here's the tension. Getting first-time guests is rarely the problem for churches that are looking at this 1,000 barrier. Getting them connected is. When you were small, that happened on its own. People showed up because they already knew somebody at your church, so they were built-in relationships. But that doesn't scale as you grow. At some point, you have too many new faces for relationships to just happen by accident. And if you don't have a clear step or environment, all those guests who you worked hard to reach just leak right back out the back door in a few weeks. Doug, this is one that I think you think a lot about, and I'm going to hand it to you for this. Talk to us about the next steps process at Orchard and some of what you helped you identify that something needed to change within your system there.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is an area we probably talk about the most on our team. We have been blessed that we reach a lot of people, a lot of guests. We praise God. Last year alone, we saw 669 people get baptized in 1 year. And our mission is to be people helping people find and follow Jesus. And they can find Jesus in that moment of faith, but then it's that journey of following Jesus and helping them take those next steps on the pathway. And so we have constantly had to right size our structure and systems to make it easy for people to take their next steps. We average about 70 guests every week. So that takes a system. No one person can handle that. There's a big difference in running a 7-Eleven where there might be 1 or 2 workers and, they do everything, and a Walmart superstore where you have to have multiple people in multiple departments. And so one of the things we always tried to do was stay ahead of our growth. So when we were running 100 people, we tried to set up our systems and structures as if we were running 200 people. When we were running 200, we tried to set up everything like we were running 400 to always be ready. When my kids were little and we buy them shoes, we'd always buy them a little bigger than they needed so they could grow into them and not grow out of them too fast. So I think it's always staying ahead of that. And we talk a lot about this at the Unstuck group, but one person is not a system. If your system has a name, that's not a system. I was just recently working with a church consulting through the Unstuck process, and I asked them about their guest services system, and they all looked at this older lady named Millie, and they said, "She's our system." And I said, "Well, what about when Millie's not here? Millie's on vacation, or and they didn't have answers." So it has to be a system, and we always say this as well. The reason most churches don't break growth barriers, they aren't spiritual, they're structural. It's in these systems. And so, we're constantly tweaking our, trying to get that first time guest to take a next step. We used to years ago have them come to a 4-week class. Well, I don't know if you've tried to get anybody to come to something 4 weeks in a row these days. It's nearly impossible. I mean, the average person goes to church about 1.5 times a month. And so we went from 4 weeks to 1 week. And then what we noticed is the only people that would go to it is if they happen to be there on that week. And so we made a monumental shift. We did a whole podcast and webinar about this, but we do a next step experience. It's only 15 minutes. It's after every service, every week. And we saw an 800% increase in people participating when we went to that.
That's incredible.
And 45% of the people that go to the next step experience actually take a next step on the pathway.
Wow.
They get into a small group, they get on a serving team, they go public with their faith. It's been a game changer. And one of the things we always embrace is what James said in the book of Acts. Let's not make it difficult for people wanting to come to God. And I think sometimes we can make it so difficult. There's too many steps and too many hoops to jump through. And so we like to say simplicity scales, complexity crashes. Keep it simple. Keep it simple.
I love that, Doug. There have been a number of churches that have adopted some format of what you guys are doing, and they've all found success with it. I've heard those stories, so that's great. All right, that leaves just a couple more, and I'll keep this one short and kind of combine these two because in a lot of ways, this one sits underneath all of the others, and it's a lack of what I'll call vision or direction. I don't love the word vision. I like direction better, but generally, vision is the most used term here. And then the funding systems that are supposed to fuel your growth. On the directional side, here's the problem that I see a lot of times. Within the whirlwind of growth that's happening here, your team needs a clear, measurable set of goals to work towards. When they don't have that, they'll start to fill in the gaps with their own goals. Pretty quickly, your kids ministry has a set of goals, your worship ministry has goals, your discipleship team has an entirely different target. And when that happens, everyone is working on good things, but they're not working on the same thing. And eventually you end up in lots of different places. You're not going to push past the 1,000 barrier unless you have a team that's aligned together around shared goals and mission. And then right alongside that is money, because growth costs money. And a lot of churches are trying to fund their next level with a generosity system that's really just annual teaching series and a stage announcement once in a while. And when giving is just a random ask instead of being built into your discipleship steps, you're always going to struggle to fund where you're trying to go. So I want to give you just a second here to reflect on the 5 tensions that we've talked about. And I want you to take your workbook, if you've downloaded that, and write down the tension that made you feel the most uncomfortable. Why do you think that one stands out above the others? We're going to take about 30 seconds here and then come back and Doug and I will talk solutions. All right, let's move on to solutions. And I want to go back to that idea right now that we started with, that your church is perfectly built for the size that it is today. And what this means that if you're breaking through that 1,000 barrier is that just working harder isn't going to get you there. You're going to have to actually restructure for the size you're becoming. Doug just talked about that. Always trying to think about, if we're a church of 100, how would a church of 200 operate? So let's start where the tensions earlier started, and that was with your leaders. Here's the core shift, and it comes straight out of a book Doug referenced earlier, Dave Ferguson's Hero Maker book. And this is a book that I got to live out firsthand when I served on Dave's team in Chicago. The win for a leader isn't how many people you're actually leading right now. It's how many leaders you can develop. Hero leaders add people to themselves. Hero makers multiply leaders through other leaders. And the truth is, you can't break 1,000 by adding. You have to start multiplying as a church. And I think the best way to do this actually starts with a structural shift, and more specifically with your span of care. So here's our rule of thumb on span of care. Every leader should be directly leading about 4 to 6 people, not trying to lead 10 people, not trying to lead 12 people, as I've seen some pastors do, 4 to 6. And if you have more than 6, here's the problem I've seen. You just stop developing anyone. At that point, you're just managing tasks. You're doing status updates, not development conversations. You physically don't have the minutes in your week to pour into another leader, help them grow, and help them raise up other leaders underneath them. So as span of care starts to creep up, leadership development is always the first thing that falls off the calendar. And that's exactly what you need most in order to grow. So the fix here is simple, but I do not think it's easy. You have to get everybody's span of care down to 4 to 6 people, starting with the senior pastor. But you can't just shrink the senior pastor's span of care tomorrow. All of those people still need somebody to report to, which means you need leaders of leaders to absorb them. And that leads to the question, who on your team actually has the capacity to be a leader of leaders? So the way you figure this out is by looking at 2 things. I'm going to show you a chart here. And the first is the axis that most churches already pay attention to. And that's how well does this person perform in their own role? Are they good at the work? But the second axis is really important to this conversation. It's often missed. Does this person develop other people? And by that, I don't mean, are they nice or are they busy? I mean 3 specific things. Do they have a track record of raising up other leaders? Do they measure success by what their team produces instead of what they're personally producing? And are they willing to release control and let other people lead, even when it's not exactly how they would do it themselves? So when you map your team against those 2 axes, you get 4 groups. Top right are the high performers who also develop people. And those are your leaders of leaders. Give them more leaders, not more tasks. If you look at the bottom right, those are your high performers who really don't develop anybody. Those are specialists. They're valuable in a lot of different situations. Keep them focused on doing what they're great at, but don't force them to try to lead other leaders. It'll frustrate them. It'll frustrate everybody who's reporting to them. On the top left are people with a real heart for developing others who just haven't gotten the reps yet. With them, you can try to coach and work on coaching them in that gap of skill that exists right now. And then on the bottom left, these people are low on both. And this is usually a wrong seat conversation. They might be a great person, but they're just in the wrong role today. So here's why I think this matters so much. Most churches try to solve a leadership problem by hiring more of those specialists that we looked at. But specialists don't reduce anybody's span of care. They're often just adding to it. You can't be fully staffed with great people and still have a senior pastor that's leading 12 people directly, because not one of those great people is actually a leader of leaders. And that brings to mind probably the single most important leader of leaders in your entire church at this stage, and that's the executive pastor. If the senior pastor is the lid or becoming the lid, the XP role, it should feel like just that release valve to your lid. A strong XP takes the day-to-day operations and leadership of the staff off of the senior pastor's plate so that the senior pastor can do the handful of things Doug referred to these earlier that only they can do: teach, carry the vision, and lead the leaders in your church. Without that role, the senior pastor is going to stay the bottleneck. So those are the leadership shifts that need to happen. Multiply instead of add. Get your span of care down to 4 to 6. identify your real leaders of leaders, and then free up your senior pastor with a strong executive pastor. If you get that right, as our founder, Tony Morgan, would say, you've taken the lid off of your church. So, Doug, I just kind of exhaustive there, but pretty quick on the leadership. Can you talk about solutions when it comes to systems in the church?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we tell our leaders is the best test of your leadership is when you are away and nothing gets missed. It's like, maybe we didn't even realize you were gone. Because that's good leadership. That means you've set up good systems and processes and you're letting your leaders lead. We try to tell our team, your goal should be to work yourself out of a job, because if you work yourself out of a job, it works yourself into a promotion, because it's the leaders of leaders that get promoted, because they can, have so many people that they can care for and lead. For instance, our guest services, director, for instance, they are over, parking, and our New Here Start Here, where guests show up, our Next Step experience. And we have a system there to follow up with all those things that happen. So from street to seat, we want people to feel cared for. And we've found that 45% of those that go to Next Step experience take that next step. We talked about that earlier, but that's a whole system that even when our guest services director isn't there, those things still happen. There's studies that are out there that have said over and over that people make a decision in the first 7 minutes if they're going to return to a church or not. I mean, that's before they hear any worship, any message or anything. And then it takes about 3 relationships for people to stick and stay. So that's why we're trying to always help them get in to a small group. You're going to make relationships. Serve on a serving team. You're going to make relationships. But we have systems and process for that. It's not just going to happen.
That's great, Doug. Yeah, we just spent a series on the podcast talking about that, how churches can identify leaders from within that eventually may make their way onto the staff, and best place to find your next staff person, probably already at your church. That's good. Okay, so for the last solution, let's talk about space. And the solution here starts with something that very few pastors enjoy, and that's math. Doug, I think you're a pastor that likes math, so you're a little bit of an anomaly. Yeah. If you remember nothing else from this part, just remember this principle. You have to know when you'll hit your lids before you actually hit them, because space problems take months, sometimes even years to solve. You can't afford just to be surprised by them. So let's do the math. 3 lids, the auditorium or worship space, your kids' ministry space, and your parking. For your auditorium, the red zone where the room starts to feel full is, and honestly, this is where people stop inviting, is somewhere around that 70 to 80% mark, like Doug and I talked about earlier. So take your seating capacity and multiply it by 0.7, or in some cases by 0.8. So if you've got 1,000 seats in your room, your real auditorium ceiling is 800, not 1,000. Parking is a little bit different. A good rule of thumb is about 1.5 people per car. So take your number of seats in your auditorium, divide by 1.5, and then you'll get the number of spaces you need. So for that 1,000 seat room we just talked about before, that's roughly 667 spaces to support a full house in your worship space. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky, because I think all these lids are connected, and your true capacity is set by the tightest of your lids. So say you've got that 1,000 seat auditorium. The auditorium lid says that you can grow to about 800 people in the auditorium. But what if you've only got 500 parking spaces? 500 spaces at 1.5 people per car can only support about 750 people. So your real lid isn't 800 in terms of 80% of your seats, it's 750. And it's your parking lot, not your worship space, that's the lid. You could add every seat you want, and it wouldn't move the attendance needle for you at all. So that's the point of the math. It tells you which lid is actually capping you, and roughly when you're going to hit it, so that you can get ahead of it instead of just being surprised by it. If nobody on your team is running these numbers and projecting them forward, that's where you need to start. Find the person who loves a good spreadsheet and then put them on it. And once you know that lid is coming, the most affordable, fastest way to create more room is always to add another service before you ever pour concrete, or launch a new campus. Doug, you've led your church through exactly this. Can you talk us through what you learned and how you might do this well?
Well, like I said, we were a portable church at a high school, 600 seat auditorium for 11 years, went from 1 to 2 to 3 services from 2007 to 2018. And then we built our first facility, about a 53,000 square foot facility. Our auditorium would seat 1,200. So it was double the size of the high school. So we were like, oh, this is amazing. We were able to drop down to 2 services, and that lasted about a year. And because in the next year, we almost doubled in size. And a lot of, our churches we work with experience that when they get into a new space. And so then we added a third service in that auditorium. And then we went to 4 services. And then now actually this summer, we're getting ready to add a 5th service. We're trying something unique on a Thursday night, try to kind of catch people before they go away for the weekend. So we're going to have 5 services. And again, that 70% rule, when we hit 70%, and when we say hit 70%, it's not like, okay, Easter, we were at 70%. Not one week does not a trend make. So when we hit 70% over 4 to 6 week period of time, that's when we know, okay, we've got to add another service. And so we're going to be adding that 5th service because we've done the math and the rate of growth we're experiencing this year. We're going to have to add another service by the end of the year. So we're kind of trying it this summer. And it's not something we spring on our team. I think that's important because when you add a whole nother service, you got to be prepared for that and have the volunteers and everybody in place. So we've been talking about this with our team for about 3 months, that this is coming, and they're excited and they're ready.
All right. Well, before we move on to the last part of today's conversation, I want you to take a minute and note the math that you most urgently need to do. Is it your real seating capacity for your worship or auditorium space? Is it how your parking truly impacts your attendance on the weekend? I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. Use your workbook and make a note of what you need to address with your team later. All right, so I'd like to end with this. We've discussed 5 tensions and the first steps to address them. And if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, I think that's actually a good thing. That means you've been paying attention this whole time. But here's what I want to leave you with. You don't have to fix all 5 of these things at once. In fact, I don't even think you should try. And here's why. Your church is only as big as the tightest lid. One of these 5 is capping you more than the other 4 right now. And until you deal with that one first, progress on the others won't actually move things forward for you. You can add all the leaders you want, but if parking is the main constraint for you, the church isn't going to grow. You can add all the parking you need to, but if there's no bench to launch that next service, that new lot isn't going to fill up. So your real next step is just identifying what is the one primary constraint for you. And I think there are 2 specific ways to find it. The first one is your gut, your intuition. You run back through the 5 tensions, the leaders, your structure, bench, space, your assimilation pathway, directional clarity, and funding. Which one made you feel a little uncomfortable? Which one did you feel in your gut? But don't just stop with that gut sense. Verify it with data, because hope isn't a strategy. So pull the actual numbers. What percentage of your people are serving? What's your volunteer to leader ratio? How close are you to 80% in your physical lids? How many of your first-time guests are still around 90 days after their first visit? One of those is going to be redder on your dashboard than the rest. So when your gut and then the data point to one of those things, that's your primary constraint. That's where you want to start. But here's the thing. Knowing your lid isn't the same thing as knowing what to do about it. Just saying we have a leadership problem, that's not really actionable. Our senior pastor has 11 direct reports and not one leader of leaders underneath him or her. That's something that's actionable and you can actually fix. So you've got to get specific with it. Doug, you've had to do this in your own context. So talk to us about how you actually diagnose the real problems once you found your lid.
Yeah, well, we always say facts are our friends and they help us make informed decisions. And the numbers tell a story. They don't tell the whole story, but they definitely tell you a story and help you make informed decisions. So we're always looking at the numbers and analyzing them to help us make our decisions. And it's interesting because just this morning, we met with all of our team. We do that on Monday for about 30 minutes, kind of celebrate the weekend, talk about what's coming up. And we just unveiled our newest org chart. It had been a while since we had tweaked it, and we realized the org chart that we currently had was not going to get us where we believe God is taking us because we had too many people. We had 6, 7 people reporting to one person, and that's too many. It should be in that 4 to 6 range. So we had one executive pastor had too many direct reports. So now we're going to 2 executive pastors in order to right size our org chart and our structure. And, the Unstuck group helped us a ton with this. Before I became a consultant with the Unstuck group, our church was a client of the Unstuck group. Back in 2017, we hired Unstuck to come in and lead us through the multi-site preparation processes. We went multi-site, and man, Unstuck was so awesome with the vital signs and the numbers. And we use them with all of our churches, and we use them at our church all the time. And they just help so much to make sure that you're in those healthy benchmarks that we talk about.
Doug, since you said that, I mean, the truth is that diagnosing work is really hard to do from the inside. When you're the one that's living in it every week, the constraint that you most need to see is usually the one that you've gotten the best at not seeing. And sometimes the most valuable thing isn't just another strategy. It's an outside set of eyes that could come in and help you see what you've stopped noticing at that point. And that's exactly what we do at the Unstuck group. We help churches take a step back, diagnose what's actually going on, and build a clear, prioritized plan to get through and break through these barriers that you're facing. So you're not trying to fix all 5 lids at once. We're looking at incremental progress. You're just going to identify that one that matters the most and work on it in the right order. So if today called something out for you that you've been feeling for a while in your gut, don't let that just become one more thing that you're going to try to carry alone, or with a small number of leaders. You can reach out to us. We'd love to help. All right. Before we move on to our interview with Pastor Andy, I want to give you just a moment to write in your workbook the one primary lid that your gut is telling you need to address first. You don't need to confirm it with data yet, but don't lose what you're already sensing from our conversation today. And the lid that your gut is telling you is most urgent right now. So write that down. We'll be back with our interview with Pastor Andy. Well, Andy, thanks for joining us and just taking a few minutes for today's webinar on breaking the 1,000 barrier. I thought you would be really key to having this conversation because I've had a chance to journey with your church over a number of years. We started working with you back in 2019. You were a little bit under 1,000. You were feeling stuck back then. And we've seen, really through the work of you and your team and God, a remarkable change in your church over the last 6 years. To where you guys are much larger than that and multi-site now. So I want to let you tell that story. But if you rewind back to 2019, you were bumping up against that 1,000 barrier and feeling stuck. What was going on at Upward at the time? And then maybe more specifically, what were you feeling as a leader?
We were working so hard. Thanks, Sean, for having us. I'm just so glad to be here and honored to give something back to you guys. I remember 2019 so well. That's the time pre-COVID. It's almost prehistoric now when we think back to it. I remember really feeling stuck. When we were talking about what do, we talked about Unstuck. That name really served you well there because we felt literally stuck. I felt like I was in one of those dreams where I was running really hard, but my feet were in the mud, and I just couldn't get anywhere. We were about 800 at the time. If I'm honest about how I was feeling then, I know we talk a lot about structure and things, but on a very personal level, I remember feeling I've always kind of been the person who tied my value to achievement. I tried to prove my value by achieving things, whether it was grades or sports or whatever. And jumping into the pastorate, 32 years ago, I started tying my value to how the church was doing and the numbers.
Yeah.
And I remember at around 800 thinking, man, if I can just get to 1,000, then I will have proven myself. If I get to 1,000, I'll be happy, that type of thing. And God had to really get my heart right on that issue. What I found out, and this may help a lot of pastors struggling to get there, if you think that crossing that growth barrier is all of a sudden going to solve that problem, it won't. We got to 1,000, and I was still measuring. The goalpost keeps moving. Then I thought maybe 1,200, maybe 1,500. Now we're breaking through 2,000. And I can honestly tell you, those numbers don't solve those insecurities in your own heart. So I was really struggling there about 2019. Yeah.
Andy, was there a specific moment when you realized, what got us here to this point isn't what's going to get us there through this barrier and to what God has for you next? And what was the first real change that you had to deal with when you realized that?
The moments, I don't know that there was a lightning flash of a moment, but I just began to see myself wearing out. I was putting more energy into it, saying, why isn't this working? I was working harder, but the results weren't there. And I realized I'm going to burn out. I'm on a treadmill here that's not getting me anywhere, and I'm going to burn out if we don't do something differently. And so the first big decision we made that helped us move forward, we had a midweek service back in 2019. We were still doing that, and it was successful. I mean, we were doing a lot of good things that were successful, but a lot of the good things weren't really focused. The energy wasn't focused toward mission. We had a lot of sideways energies going on, and that just wasn't helping us get where we needed to go. So one of the major things is we stopped doing that midweek service, and we had some people upset about that. But, that was in July of 2019. And then, as we all know, COVID, the pandemic time came in March of the next year. And because we had given ourselves that additional margin, we were able to pivot during COVID and deal with all of that. And then when we reopened later that year, we were able to do some very creative things to get started again. But that all was made possible by a difficult and a courageous decision to stop something that was pretty beloved in our church.
Andy, so much of what we've covered during the webinar today comes back to the leader. How did your own role have to change as the church grew? And maybe what was one of the harder things that you had to kind of give up and let go of?
Growth is so hard for pastors, Sean. And I think part of it is we got into this because we felt called from God, but we also love people, and we love the relationships with people. And at the time, we were struggling through the 800,000. I had 8 direct reports, and I began to realize I cannot do that. I cannot do what the senior pastor is supposed to do. That is champion the culture, train leaders, be the primary teacher and speaker. You guys taught us those roles. I can't do those while I'm dealing in the everyday details of 800 people in a church. So I had to fly a bit higher and lead upward from the 30,000 foot level instead of 10,000, whatever the analogy is.
Yeah.
I just had to pull the stick back and fly a little higher. So I went from 8 direct reports to 1. Have an incredible executive pastor named, Greg well. Everybody knows Greg. He's just incredible. I could not overstate his contribution to Upward, but letting go of the proximity to staff members and the proximity to all the details was really hard for me, and I suspect it is for a lot of pastors.
Yeah.
And I still do that. I still walk the halls. I talk to them. I love them. I go out to lunch with them. But truthfully, not having them as direct reports allows me to be their pastor in a way that I couldn't before. And it's really hard to see that when you're on the front side of that decision.
For the pastor that's tuned into the webinar today, who's sitting at 700 or 800, maybe even 900, and they're feeling exactly what you felt in that season, what's one thing that you'd want to say to them?
Well, I'll circle back again to say, Pastor, I know how you feel. I really do. I've been there. And growth will not feed your heart and feed your soul. Pastor Wayne Cordero, great pastor in Hawaii. I was able to shadow him for about 10 days back in about 2006 or so. Went to Hawaii and spent some time with him and a group of pastors. And he said, if you want to grow your church, you have to grow your own heart. And the thing I had to grow out of was, again, that need for affirmation by numbers and growth and achievement. And I had to lay that down, and I had to find my value in Christ. I had to find my value in seeing lives transformed one at a time. So I had to do that. Also, I would say to them, you have some difficult decisions ahead, and you have to say no to some things, but those things won't be as hard as you imagine. Don't let your imagining of a catastrophic thing happening scare you away from making the right choice. It'll be hard for a season, and you will upset some people, and you'll have to change, but the benefits after you get over that hump are so incredible. I don't have a single regret. I would do it all again. So I'd say to Pastor, keep going and keep making those right decisions. Let him be what determines your value.